Hello guys. Okay, so I don't know how long this comeback is going to be for. My work starts again in a couple of weeks and I'm in a lot and it's going to be busy, so I may not have a lot of time to actually do videos. I just want to come back this particular time because I felt as though it'd been long enough and you guys had waited a long time. The last couple of months of me have been really fun and a lot of kind of stuff has went on in my head, just in my life, and I just wanted to have like a big break from everything, enjoy time with my friends and just kind of exist and do other things. The channel was really fun for me for a long time and it still absolutely is. It's just not the same passion project as it was. I'm just doing them as and when I can. I hope you guys understand that creating content is just something that it comes and goes in spikes of interest, and right now I'm kind of at a lull, but I'm still enjoying it, but it will be much more sporadic, and I should have probably let you guys know, but I was just enjoying life for a while. I do apologise about that. But this time I'm bringing you someone underrated and underappreciated. I've seen not many people talk about Victon, and vocally Victon are really something and really interesting. To me, their music is only written in a key that really suits the voice of a couple of people, which may make some people not seem as good all the way through, but all the way through vocally they have some very good singers, a lot of tones going on, a lot of styles, a lot of techniques, and a lot of just backstory. So I'm excited to bring these guys to you if you don't know who they are. They really deserve a lot of attention, particularly vocally. So without further ado, let's get into the vocal ranking of Victon. Let's go. Okay, so last on this particular list, as is often the case, is the main rapper of Victon. And Hanse, or Hans, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, I'm going to go for Hanse. Bless him, he's not a vocalist. He tries and has fun with it, and I respect that. But from a technical standpoint, he's pretty much the only member of Victon that doesn't really have a whole lot going on. Anyway, let's watch what he's got, and I'll try and break it down.
그대인지 몰라 불 꺼진 방 나 혼자 널 떠올려봐도 점점 더 흐릿해져가 Way back, way back, way back 잔소리 stop it 알아서 할게 내가 뭐가 되든 내가 알아서 할 테니까 좀 전할게 그땐 왜 몰랐을까
Okay, so I'm going to preface this all by saying Hanse is an incredible rapper. Now, I'm not a rap expert, but kind of from what I've heard of people who are really good, he has a lot of the traits that makes him fantastic. I just want to say that right now because that's what his job is in Victon, and that's the main primary role that he operates in. That being said, vocally, I only really saw one of two things kind of happen, which is where he sang in a slightly more rap-leaning, easy kind of way with his natural vocal tone, and then when he kind of tried and had fun to sing other things, which kind of showcased his limitations a little bit more. Okay, so what his voice primarily is known for is it's really nasal and really whiny. Now, his voice kind of sounds like that all the time. Now, that's an interesting kind of default to have because it automatically puts you in like a mid place. Like, if you've got a whiny, high nasal voice, you're not really going to be singing low a great deal, and your voice is going to have like a little bit of presence in the mid-range. And Hanse, yeah, fair play, he does. When he's kind of singing alongside other members' parts and doing things like that, his voice will kind of maintain with a bit of chord closure, kind of in the middle tone. It can do things like that fairly well. But his main and glaring issue is he doesn't really understand placement, changes of dynamics, or changes of tone, really. So he's pulling chest pretty much the entire time, and due to lack of practice, his spectrum isn't super wide, so kind of when he's in the middle, it's alright, it's fine. Then as he goes a little bit higher, instead of kind of placing into the head, or using more of a mixed configuration, or using any head voice, or anything like that, his voice will crack more often than not, because he just simply doesn't know what to do with it to operate in any keys higher than kind of his spoken tone. As well as that, his tuning isn't very good. And the few performances I did see where he was singing kind of their songs with different people's parts, his voice could get to the pitch to a point, but again, it just sounded a little bit off. It was a bit flat or a bit sharp. I don't want to discredit him, because most people I give really good positives to, but Hanse doesn't sing. He's not a great singer, and that is a totally fair thing to say for someone that is this good and this underappreciated a rapper. Now, in the few times I did kind of see him rap sing, he was a lot more comfortable. He kind of stayed very spoken, very soft, and very easy. Again, if you don't like a really nasal vocal tone, it's not going to sound that pleasant, but when he's kind of keeping it a little bit more melodic and not using more rasp and more power and more flow, there is a little bit of a singing voice there. It's just really, really limited, and he doesn't really do a great deal with it. Now, could he be better? Could he do things later in life if he wanted to practice singing? Of course he could. With that nasal placement, that thins things out beautifully. If he just learnt placement and did other things with weight and stuff like that, he might have something decent to him, but as of right now, not so much. Okay, so I'm going to preface this again by saying Subin is super young, and I think he has a lot of potential vocally. He's got like kind of a dream vocal tone default, just doesn't do a great deal with it yet. But I think if he gets some more confidence, he will be pretty decent in future. But for right now, he's just okay, and we'll dive into what he does. Okay, so Subin's primary role in Victon is kind of a bit of a confusing one. It's labelled as like vocalist and rapper, but his rap is quite a melodic, high, light sitting rap. Of course, Hanse does most of the rap parts, and Seungsik does more rap parts as well. So Subin's left to kind of do this kind of hybrid thing in between, which really makes use of his very, very light, beautiful dream vocal tone. Okay, so K-pop as a whole is written in, it's fair to say, a bloody high key. If you're a low voice guy or a baritone, you're gonna have to do some technically great things to do stuff. Subin's exactly the opposite for me. His voice is so light and so easy and relaxed in kind of a mid to high range spectrum that he isn't needing to technically do anything overly impressive to get some pretty decent and comfortable sounds that work well in Victon's music. So what I mean by that is his voice is in a very light default. He isn't using a lot of chord closure or a great deal of air really. He's just keeping things very, very, very spoken. And because his voice is so light and doesn't have too much presence all the way through the spectrum, he can maintain a fairly decent tone and kind of untuned pitch up through a decent part of his voice, through the mid-range and the high range. But because he doesn't use a great deal of chord closure, his voice doesn't have a great deal of oomph or power or projection. And if he just added a little bit more chord closure to his sound, he could maybe get some like decent belts and mixed voice in the future. But right now he doesn't really mix. He just keeps things very easy, very light. It's fairly untuned, but technically it's not doing anything kind of stand out or that will blow anybody away. It's just really thin, really light and really easy. But because of that, he doesn't really use a lot of head voice. He doesn't really add much weight into any part of his voice. So it does lack a little bit of presence, and he does seem to lack a little bit of confidence sometimes. So when he's close to the microphone and he's singing really softly with a bit more air in his sound, it does kind of fall away and fall into the background, and the enunciation doesn't work quite as well. Once he gets a bit more confidence, uses a little bit more chord closure in his sound possibly, and brings it to slightly higher space, which he has kind of half showcased on occasion, he could have something really quite good. But for now he's got a nice default, doesn't really use much of it, and doesn't really technically impress anyone doing anything too difficult, but he has a nice light vocal tone that works well in Victon, and I think in future he could be really good. But just right now he's alright, keeping it easy, which you gotta respect. Okay, so now we're getting to more of the people that sing predominantly rather than just rap or do kind of melodic rap parts. Pyeongchang for me is the guy that has the kind of nice, light, almost angel voice that people like to coin in K-pop, and technically it's A bit limiting, but still a lovely, pleasant sound. Let's watch what he does, and I'll break it down.
너로 가득한 맘, 널 닮아가는 나, 날 위한 선물, 꿈보다 더 주고 싶어. 내 맘을 모두 전하고 싶어. 잠들지 않는 매일 숨지게 삼킨 뭐니 또 원하기 못 떠나게 넌 내 손을 끌어당기지. 세상을 막아선 저 드높은 벽 앞에 두려움이 보다 앞서 맞서도 자신 있게. 밝아진 방 나 혼자 널 떠올려봐도 점점 더 흐릿해져가. 더 그리운 밤 Late night, late night, late night. 이 악몽을 끝내. Hello baby, my name is 하고 목소리 크게 울려 퍼져나갈 테니까. Yeah. 흐른다 떨어진다 너의 그 눈물 맞춘 나 같아. 난 몸이 가는 대로 가. Losing control, flip that coin. 아름답잖아. 얼마든 네가 만든 미로에 제발로 걸. 우리 생각해 잠이 들 때까지 우리 생각해.
Okay, so as I mentioned that little intro there, Pyeongchang's the guy who operates with the very light, airy, easy, a little bit nasal configuration. A lot of K-pop groups have that one guy that kind of sits in the mid to low range and has nice easy parts, nice and relaxed. Now, his voice is really pretty, it's really beautiful. In the lower end of his voice, he's using an awful lot of air in the sound. Now, that keeps it relaxed and comfortable and gets him into a mid-range nice and efficiently with not too much strain and not too much over-compression. However, because he doesn't use a great deal of chord closure in that particular sound, as he brings it up in range, he doesn't really have that feeling of connection to really project particularly well. So, when he adds a little bit more oomph to his sound as he goes a little bit higher, his natural nasal placement kind of kicks in. Now, because he isn't keeping the sound super heavy, that nasality works up until a certain point. It thins out the already airy vocal tone into a higher space, and when the connection comes in a little bit, he can get to some relatively decent mid notes. However, because it is nasal and it's very light and there's not really much used feeling of chord closure, he's getting a little bit tight as he goes up fairly quickly, and you can see he's pretty much reaching and pulling for notes that are kind of anywhere above his first bridge sort of area. So it means that he doesn't really have a great deal of spectrum to go into and much dynamic potential with his voice. It's just pretty and works in the middle part. When he's airy and low, it does sound really easy and relaxed and pleasant, but because there is a bit of a pull, a bit of a strain towards the middle of it, and he isn't using any chord closure from down low, he can't really get a great deal higher. His voice has what I like to call a little bit of a ceiling. He doesn't really crack a great deal or do anything like that, but he doesn't really get into a higher space than where his nasality allows him to get into. He doesn't really project into a big mix, he doesn't use falsetto hugely well, he can do it fairly okay like most K-pop idols can, but he's mainly known for his lower, breathier stuff, and then kind of the middle, slightly more pulled nasal, still quite soft and relaxed stuff. So yeah, I think he's a nice singer, he's got a good voice, but he does limit himself dynamically a little bit because he doesn't really use a great deal of chord closure, and his default is nasality, but nasality that doesn't thin things out only, it also gets it a little bit throaty, which lacks his dynamic potential. He's still a decent singer, but there is some way to go for him to get into a bigger, higher spectrum. Okay, so Chan is a super interesting one because to me, of all the guys in Victon, his voice is a little bit thicker, a little bit darker, and a little bit lower, and almost suits the key of Victon the least, but he does some interesting things with his voice to try and maintain a decent presence in their songs. Let's watch what he does, and I'll break it down.
어디를 걸어도 전부 네 적도 보일까 왜 내가 듣는 노래 노력으로 안 되는 게 있다는 게 시간을 되돌릴 수 있다면 네가 있는 미래 그려 괜찮아 울지마 너도 나와 함께라 기쁘단 것을 알아 너의 모습이 저 달이 되어 우린 아직 이어져 있어 꿈에서도 내 앞에 네가 있는 걸 보면 나라는 모든 걸 시리다 Let's talk about love 서로를 그렇게 다시 그리워진 널 매일 저 위에 그려보면 해도 널 붙잡진 않았어 다시 돌아올 그대를 알기 때문에.
Okay, so I'm going to preface everything I'm going to say by saying that Chan does a really good job the majority of the time while singing Victon songs. As a low-voiced guy who, while researching, likes to sing along to parts of particular songs of particular artists, I've been trying to sing along to some Victon parts, and oh my good god, his parts are difficult. Like, the main vocalist stuff, Yak and Lightning mix, but Chan's parts are written in such a bizarre little range for someone with his voice. He's got to do an awful lot of things to try and work out the whole spectrum. So, just like Pyeongchang, he sings in his low range with quite a lot of air the majority of the time. For someone with a thicker, darker voice like he has, you would think that he would automatically use a little bit more chord closure in the lower end of his voice to keep it nice and relaxed and nice and full and bring that weight up into a more efficient space. Not so much because his voice is a bit darker and Victon's key is so astronomically stupid light and high that two people have to basically do everything. His voice has to maintain a very relaxed position, and that's with a lot of air. So, in a live setting sometimes when he's using that air, his tuning will fall away a little bit because it is quite difficult to tune to air if that isn't the predominant role that you've got in that group. Because Chan doesn't get asked to sing very low very often. He gets kind of mid-belt-ish, but because of the way he's having to sing his lows, he doesn't have the chord closure down there. He brings it up into the mid space, and the mid space, it works very well. Because it's darker and thicker, his voice naturally wants to be a little bit heavier. So when he's in the middle of his voice, he does have a nice projection, he's got a nice amount of power, and sometimes he brings it a little bit into his head and manages to open up a little bit into a bigger space to make a nice open resonant kind of sound. Often though, because he's using a lot more air down at the bottom of his voice, as he brings up this way, because he's not used to it through the whole spectrum of range, he can sound a little bit tight, a little bit pulled, and he is a little bit inconsistent because of that. I feel as though if Chan, I once saw a clip of him doing like a musical part and he was singing like this. He was singing a lot darker with a slightly lowered larynx. If he was given a position where he can use that configuration of connection and sing a little bit lower, his voice would be a lot more consistent. But for now, he's being asked to kind of sing lower and breathier to make it relaxed, and then a little bit higher, it's a little bit pulled, and the other guys handle the high stuff, but he handles a lot of the mid-range, and it's good and it's decent. It's just inconsistent because he's having to pull quite a lot of weight in a voice that isn't using a lot of weight down low, even though it kind of would want to. So I think his voice is really good. It's just he's not being sung in the right group, but it still sounds good. But he is a little bit pulled, which is limiting his potential for a mix a little bit. But he's still great and a fantastic dancer, so it is what it is. Right, this is where it got tricky. Victon as a whole suit two people's voices. One of them is Sejun and one of them is coming up. He has an interesting voice, and initially I was like, oh, could he be first? When I was listening to everybody, but all the way through, not quite, but he does some things like really well, and I'm like, eh? And then he does other things kind of not so well, I'm like, okay, understood what his role is, but he's a good singer. Let's watch him, and I'll break it down the best I can.
No matter how we go, 정답은 늘 뻔해. 현실이 대화했어. 이쯤 되면 내 말은 예언. 것처럼 baby stand and deliver. Holy hand to the make me a sinner. 내 원산의 걸음 숨에 밀도 그마저도 다 뺏겨.
So Sejun's voice kind of baffles my entire brain because it does things that like don't make sense really. He has like a weightless voice, but also a really heavy voice in a certain particular key. Now, okay, the main negative of Sejun's voice, which is why I've kind of put him third and not second or first, which you could kind of argue in certain songs he sounds like he could almost be first. His voice down low has next to no real lower range whatsoever. He is predominantly used for high belting, very sensibly, so he does it bloody well, but as he kind of goes any lower than that, his voice just becomes like this. It like almost has absolutely no presence whatsoever. I heard him once kind of like add a bit more chord closure at the bottom, like this, like for flip a coin right at the bottom or something. And I was like, okay, so he can do it, but a lot of the time he sets up almost exclusively vocally to sing higher passages, which makes sense because he's a lead vocalist and he's given basically all the high notes or like all the higher sections of bridges alongside one other guy I'll get to in a moment. But his voice down low has not really any presence, not really kind of anything to it, and it doesn't really support in any area that is anything other than this. But this is done really, 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 really well. And I'm like, eh! So literally, as I say, his voice goes from this to da da da, and it goes like really, I can't sing that key that high, that was quite pulled, but his voice just, it goes from nothing to absolute presence in the higher range. And I really want to understand why, but it's kind of a tricky one because normally if you have absolutely no chord closure or feeling connection down at the bottom, bringing it up makes it sound squeezed and quite tight, and yet maybe when he's in his higher belts and higher keyed kind of mixes, there's a little bit of a laryngeal placement, so it's a little bit throaty and a little tiny bit tight. But saying that, he also sounds like he can do those passages all day, every day, very free, with a lot of projection, a lot of power, and just good presence. He has a really nice chesty mixed belt. Up at this kind of, I want to say G4, A4 kind of area, his voice is big, it's open, it's present, which is bizarre because the rest of his range has next to no chord closure whatsoever. It all just happened in this section, but happens in this section really, really, really well. But I guess his limiting factor is because he doesn't use much down low and it's all here, he doesn't really have much of a space to go up into either. So while he's really consistent at this A and maybe even a B4 possibly, he doesn't quite have the placement to put it more into his head and mix really a lot further to get into those stupid high tenor belts and stuff. So for me, Sejun's voice is very consistent here, not a great deal here, and then yet to be explored up there. Unlike number 2, who's explored kind of all of it a little bit more, which is why I put Sejun third. But where he's good, and I want to see how he develops. Now again, there was a little battle in my head between who's the better main vocalist of Victon or the main vocalist of X1. Now, as you can see, I ultimately decided on Victon, but Sungwoo's voice is like, it's one of those voices that you take kind of technique, which is like number 1 for me, over just natural God-given range, and a voice that works really well in a lot of areas, kind of, which is what Sungwoo has. Let's watch him sing and listen to this, and I'll try my best to break it down, but he's like a little bit baffling.
없는 내 모습 길을 잃은 아이처럼 겁이 널 사랑하게 된 이유를 사연들을 내 얼굴에 묻어놓고 나는 정말 바보야 내가 듣는 노래엔 다 우리에게 보낼까 돼 시간을 되돌릴 수 있다면 미리 아파 간직하고 싶은 건가
So, the reason I didn't put Sungwoo number 1 is because his voice, like, technically, particularly in the mid and lower end of it, isn't, like, mega impressive. He just has a really, really thin, really light, really high voice. Like, it can actually be a little bit unexpected, the keys that he is singing in sometimes. When he's singing casually, he is like mixing like borderline female keys like it's absolutely no man's business, and it's not difficult whatsoever for him. But then there's other radio performances when he's kind of singing the lower end of his voice where the tuning falls away and the technique just isn't really there at all. It's a really bizarre voice. It's kind of a dream voice to have for K-pop a lot of the time, because he is like able to sing in like that sort of area, like big and connected and open and full and go higher. Like, Sejun to me is third because he doesn't have that placement to mix any higher than that mid-range. Seungsik for me doesn't have that problem because his voice is so light and so thin, but uses like a tiny bit more chord closure down low than Sejun's does. He can sing kind of the same area just as easily, although it is slightly high larynx and slightly thin with slightly thin vowels. He does think like that a lot of the time. It is very androgynous almost. But it gets him up into that place seemingly very, very, very easy, and it doesn't lack presence. When he's singing like in his mid-range and then moves his tone up into this higher place, he moves it into his head. He doesn't just belt and bring up loads of chest weight from a high larynx. He does use a little bit of head placement to keep it nice and open, nice and forward. And when he's up at this C5 maybe, he is still singing, sounding like it's very relaxed. Again, the larynx is a little bit high, so it's not quite as relaxed as it sounds like it is. It's not as technically perfect as it could be, but he's singing in keys because of his natural placement very, very, very well. As well as that, he is showcased on occasion that he can bring that even higher. Again, he's using a little bit more weight and squeezing a little bit, but because his voice has a little bit more presence and weight all the way through than Sejun's does, he can use this consistently and then operate a little bit higher as well, moving it further into his head to unleash some mass-placed head voices on occasion. They're not super controlled or super amazing, but when he gets that, like, sometimes D5 kind of belt, like, fly high, yeah, or whatever it is in, like, X1's Flash, he can do things like that seemingly very easy without having to try a great deal, and that makes me very jealous. But as I said, the main negative of his voice, which is why I didn't put him first, is technically kind of below this. It's just okay, quite breathy, doesn't really have a great deal of chord closure, more than Sejun's and more presence than him, but doesn't really have much, and it sounds like he doesn't really want to be there. He just wants to be belting, wants to be mixing, and he does that really well, really efficiently with a nice thin vocal tone, and kind of down low, it's not quite as strong as number one by any means. Right, so I was almost taken in, even though I don't do this, by the high notes equals better singer kind of opinion, because Sungwoo and Sejun both made me go, whoa! But as I researched, it became quite clear that Seungsik, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, S-I-K, I'm going for shik, is technically kind of almost leagues ahead of them both, all the way through a spectrum of range. Does he have the most technically pleasing sound? Yes. Does he have the most tonally pleasing sound? Not necessarily, but I think I have reasons for that, but I'll break down what he does and we'll get into all of that. Let's watch him sing. So, I'm going to start this and make a bit of a claim. Now, please don't shout at me. I don't think Sungsik's voice suits Victon's key that well. because his voice isn't as high as Sungwoo or Sejun's. He doesn't mix in the same places, but he mixes better. Now, all the way through, technically his voice is really quite good, and he does some really good things to get into similar areas that he's being asked to sing into, but he shines particularly solo or when he's singing like OSTs. When his voice is given the range it's meant to be in, it's fantastic. And when he's singing Victon songs, it's good, but it's not as comfortable. Right. So his voice is naturally a little bit darker. It's not baritonal by any means, but when you watch him sing, he's got a lot more presence in his lower range. There's a little bit of chord closure there. Again, there's still quite a lot of air in the sound to keep it nice and relaxed, to thin out as he goes to the middle of his voice to sing in these kind of higher keys nice and efficiently, but his voice has a little bit more presence. If Sejun's kind of like that all the time, and Sungwoo's kind of like that all the time, Seungsik's more like that all the time. There's a little bit more of a chest grab to it, it's a little heavier, and it gives him a lot more space to work into. Now, because of that natural chord closure, when he gets into the middle of his voice, he's automatically more comfortable, which allows his voice to have presence and weight kind of all the way through, and he dynamically can choose what he wants to do because of that. He isn't stuck like the other two guys I've mentioned, kind of soft low and big high, because his voice just wants to do that naturally. He has total control of both, in my opinion. I've seen him sing the middle of his range really relaxed with a little bit more air because of the natural nasality he uses as well. He uses nasality in his tone to thin things out, so if you like a nasal tone placement, it's okay. If you don't, it's not the most pleasant sound. He's not my favourite voice in Victon, I wouldn't say. I'd say Sejun's probably is, to be honest. But Seungsik's voice is using nasality really, really efficiently to use this kind of thicker, darker sound from down low to thin things out into this middle space. It allows him to bring the tone very forward and very open when he wants to. His main negative is he has a little habit of keeping his mouth really tight, so occasionally his notes can go ee, and it's like they're not super squeeze and super pulse. He's used to singing that particular coordination, but he is bringing up quite a lot of weight because of the nasality he uses and the natural chord closure that he has. It can sound a little bit tight if he doesn't open his mouth, which makes it a little bit more inconsistent in that really, really high key. But for all of it, because of the nasality and the chord closure and the presence, he's putting things very forward into an open space, and he is unleashing really solid, strong, chest dominant mixes. And I've heard him go into his head a little bit more to thin things out, and he unleashes nice higher mixes too. They're not as high as the two guys that I've mentioned. I'm not sure I fully believe the one from Mortal Songs where he goes like, ah! It's like really high. I'm not sure I buy that necessarily, but a little bit lower than that I certainly can when you thin things out, and he sounds really present and really good throughout the entire of his range with a really great chest dominant mix. And I just don't think that Victon shows him off fully because he has to use more falsetto work when he's doing those keys, which still is really good. He's got good head voice placement, it's just a little bit thinner because his voice doesn't want to operate quite that high. But here, a little bit lower, technically he's leagues ahead of everybody and is by far the best in Victon, and I think he's an amazing, amazing singer. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching. I know I waffled on quite a lot there. It's my first one back for a while, so my brain's just getting back used to everything and doing everything like that. I don't know who's going to be next, and I hope you enjoy this, and I don't know when it's going to be because obviously work starts again. Thank you for being patient, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Good.